Well, I should explain, I'm trained as a geographer. And as geographers, we sort of supposed to like understanding a lot of things going on in different parts of the world. And one of the things that's always been very exciting to me is to try to visit and get a sense of how uneven geographical development is unfolding. And over time, of course, I've been more and more interested in how capital has its own forms of uneven geographical development. And for me, I think it's always very important to go to some place and talk to people and look at things and smell things and feel things. And so Bolivia, of course, given the history over the last 15, 20 years, has, I think, been a remarkable site of resistance to neoliberal forms of capitalism. Whether it's a site of resistance to capitalism is a bigger question. But I think that this is a remarkable country with a remarkable history, and particularly its most recent history. So I'm very delighted to have the opportunity to come here for the first time. Well, this is a big question. I think it's important to understand that there was a revolution in many respects in the way in which global capital was working, which began in the 1970s, and we generally call it the neoliberal transformation. And one of the characteristics of that transformation was, of course, first that the world's money system lost its metallic base, so the question of gold became irrelevant to what was happening monetarily. Along with that, there came an attempt to discipline labor, and one of the ways to do that was, of course, by liberating finance capital, which is what I call the butterfly form of capital. It can go around the world, it can land anywhere, it can disappear anywhere. So money capital became highly mobile and began to move around the world very, very quickly to different places. And as a result of that, there have been, since the 1970s, innumerable financial crises. If you count up the financial crises that existed between 1945 and 1975, you find very few. After 1975, it's Mexico in 1982, and then it's somewhere else, it's Bolivia, and of course it's, so the financial difficulties just keep running around the world, which matches with one of my theoretical points, which is that capital never solves its crisis problems. It only moves them around. So it's been moving around very, very quickly. And so, for instance, at the end of the 1990s, we have a huge crisis in East Asia, but it was contained in East Asia. Later on, we had crises in Brazil, and then, of course, Argentina blew up in 2001, 2002. And so the crisis is moving around. Finally, it comes to the United States in 2007, 2008. But I think the significance of it coming to the United States was the United States is the center of the world's monetary system. And it was only the United States that could make the crisis go completely global. And that, of course, takes the pressure off the United States. I mean, in East Asia in 1997, 98, or in Russia shortly afterwards, they had to solve their crises on their own. When the crisis hit the United States and the financial things became difficult in the United States, decisions were made, and I think the decision not to bail out Lehman Brothers in September of 2008 was almost a deliberate decision to send the crisis global, as far as it was possible to do so. And of course, everywhere in the world was hit to some degree or other. But some parts of the world were less hit than others. And that's where the uneven geographical development came in. China was hit very hard for about a year, then China revived. All of those countries that were supplying raw materials to China, I think, managed to come out of the crisis fairly quickly. And Latin America, I think, came out of it faster than, say, Europe did, or some other parts of the world. So that the crisis had effects here, obviously. But to the degree that at that time, by that time, most of Latin America was backing away from, the pure forms of neoliberal thinking, and was therefore you were a little bit politically insulated. I think also you were economically insulated because there has been this shift in trading patterns from Latin America much more towards the China trade. And any country that got on the China trade was protected to some degree because the Chinese economy has been the only one that's really been powering the world's capitalist system back on track, which is a bit of an irony, really, that it takes a communist power to save capital from complete collapse. Well, there are several different questions wrapped up there. The United States is a country that has long struggled with racism. Race, from its very inception of the United States, was always a crucial element in the social scene. And in recent times, while there have been clear advances made on, for instance, civil rights questions, and that was in the 1960s, of course, very strong movements were made, and there's no question that the black population in the United States made significant gains in terms of civil liberties and political inclusion in the 1960s. But as often happens, and I think in any political system you recognize this, it's very often 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and you just hope it doesn't become 1 step forward and 2 steps back. I think what was significant, has been significant about Trayvon Martin and what's going on in Jefferson is the fact that something like a not very radical newspaper like the New York Times put a series of pictures on its front page contrasting what's going on in Jefferson, Missouri right now with what was going on in American cities in the 1960s. And I think there's a feeling that even though we have a black president, there is still a hard core of racial discrimination, which is connected, of course, to impoverishment, is connected to unemployment, and it's connected to the bad things that went on in the housing market. For example, in the foreclosures occurred in the housing crisis. The first wave of foreclosures disproportionately hit black populations, immigrant populations, to some degree Hispanics and so on, and women. So there was a discriminatory effect of the crisis in terms of the housing crisis. So I think everybody's now recognizing that the gains that were made in the 1960s are in peril, and that something has to be done to actually reanimate the anti-racism campaigns that emerged in the 1960s. And of course the thing about the 1960s that was that there were uprisings in many cities in the United States. Los Angeles, Watts, Detroit, and then of course in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King, something like 120 cities in the United States were there was riot, revolution, uprisings. And this was actually a key feature, I think, that led white America to accommodate more to the idea of black rights. And I think we're seeing a little bit of a rerun of that, because there has been, if you like, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and the 1 step back is what we're seeing in play in the Trayvon Martin case, and also in what is happening in Jefferson, Missouri. A lot of this depends upon how you define neoliberalism. Some people define neoliberalism as a kind of utopian ideological project, which was superimposed by, certain influences and thinkers. Some people just regard it as a sort of the unfolding of a political project. In my own case, I've always regarded it as a class project to try to re-establish absolute class power, both economically and politically. And from that perspective, neoliberalism is certainly not over. It is in fact alive and strong. It has actually strengthened in the midst of the crisis. If you look at who has come out of the crisis very well, in the United States, for example, it's the top 1%. They've recovered, any losses that they had in 2008 have been recovered. Billionaires around the world have actually recovered extremely well. The centralization of wealth and power has gone even further than it was before the crisis. There is a saying which is, never let a good crisis go to waste. So what do you see also? The crisis is now an excuse to impose austerity, which means cutting back on state expenditures, cutting back on social expenditures, actually cultivating unemployment, underemployment, precarious labor practices, so that actually the whole neoliberal project is going very, very well, if you think of it in those terms, and it has not been disappeared at all. The one thing, however, I think is important is that there was an ideological moment in which those people pursuing this kind of were sort of anti-state and anti-government and all those things. That was always a mask. It was never the case that the state was not heavily involved in supporting the neoliberal project. And in fact, it was the capturing of the state by money power which largely led the state into the kinds of practices in which it's, instead of redistributing income from the wealthy to the poor, it's been extracting wealth like crazy from the poor. And if we look at a process that I'm very interested in, which is what I call accumulation by dispossession, that the poor and even segments of the middle class are being dispossessed of many of their assets and many of their rights, pension rights and all those sorts of things, and rights to decent services and health care and free education, all those kinds of things. They're being destroyed in the name of, this is the path to get out of the crisis. So both in Europe and in North America, you see austerity being preached as part of the solution to the crisis, when austerity is about weakening the powers of the mass of the population for the benefit of the very, very top. So in terms of concentration of wealth and power, the top 1% are doing extremely well. They're not bothered at all by what has happened. And there is a tremendous concentration of corporate wealth and power, which of course, as I think you well know, here in Bolivia and elsewhere, is doing its best to extract as much wealth as it can from where the whole global economy, if it possibly can do so, if it doesn't face up to very strong kind of resistance. Well, my first caveat in answering this is that I'm not an expert on, what has been happening here in Bolivia or Ecuador or Venezuela. I've read a lot. I've spent a little time now in Ecuador. And I'm very impressed, of course, with the rhetoric about buen vivir and citizens' revolution. But I'm equally impressed by the fact that on the ground, this hasn't necessarily changed so very much. And I think the rhetoric and the reality are two different things now. It is impossible, I think, to create socialism overnight. It's impossible to create socialism in one country overnight. So while I have a lot of sympathy with what the governments must struggle with when they are faced with trying to turn that rhetoric into reality, I kind of think that also we need to rethink very much what the nature of the anti-capitalist program should be about. And I don't think that is yet clear to enough of mass forces on the left as to what it really means to be anti-capitalist and what it would take to be anti-capitalist. And I think we need to think that through much more clearly. For example, for certain people, buen vivir means having an automobile, a shopping mall, living in a gated community. To me, that is a capitalistic form of urbanization, which I think is not conducive to equality, egalitarianism. It is not comfortable at all with socialist values. So to me, I think that we have to start to be very clear as to what kinds of transformations would be required to turn this general notion of buen vivir, which actually is a fairly empty notion until you specify it on the ground, until it's turned into something which is, I think, more consistent with what a socialist ethic would look like. And in the question, this issue, for example, over is a society concerned most of all with delivering use values to people to assure a decent life, or is it concerned to actually monetize everything, commodify everything, and to presume that a market system can in fact deliver the goods and a capitalistic system can deliver the goods? Right now, one of the big problems is that you have, in my mind, you have institutions and also, in a way, a kind of a program which is trying to make out that capitalism can be a reasonable system and an ethical system, so that we have a kind of a mask being created that kind of says, and a lot of this is actually located in the NGO movements, and a lot of it is located in the philanthropic movements. And if you look at, the sort of the big philanthropy movements with, Soros and Gates Foundation and everything and what they're doing, is that in many respects it seems to me that there's an attempt to rebrand capitalism as having the capacity to be a good form of capitalism, and I'm very, very skeptical. I'd like to think, yes, maybe it could be, but I'm very, very skeptical as to that, whether that's possible. One of the things I'm always impressed with, and I suppose this is my dialectical sense, which comes from thinking in Marxist terms, is you never look at anything and say it's all bad. You look at something and say, okay, this is the way capital is delivering commodities to people right now. It's doing it through construction of shopping centers, and there are many negative things to be said about that, which include, for example, the destruction of small shops and the destruction of proximity between people who produce food, for example, and who consume it, all those kinds of things. So you can make all kinds of criticisms. But at the same time, once we've got them, people start to use them in ways which in some instances are quite positive. They become utopian spaces where people can go and actually consort and develop social relations in a certain kind of way. And while I don't think that shopping centres are going to be the sites of revolutionary uprisings, on the other hand, I think that some of the discontents which we're now seeing, particularly in what you might call middle class and lower middle class segments of the population, are actually the shopping mall people who are getting more and more frustrated because, okay, it's a place of sociality, they go there, they see all of these commodities, they don't have the money to buy all of the commodities. It's a site of frustration as well as a site of fulfillment. And in fact, in some ways, it's a site where there's a good deal of critique of commodity culture, which is there, ongoing in the mall itself. So it's not entirely a kind of a site which completely deadens people. It does that, but at the same time, it's also a site where certain ideas and so on start to be generated, and new ways of socializing and new ways of doing politics and new ways of exploring liberatory practices can actually get instituted.